However, I want to tip my hat to Irving Weber. I never met the man. I know a good deal about him. Not the least of his accomplishments was that he was an All-American swimmer, and he was later named Iowa City's official historian. Now, as a professional historian, someone who's trained in history, gone to school to study many years the art of history, one is supposed to be skeptical of some amateur who hasn't gone through that type of study and hasn't got the appropriate degrees. But in fact, I have a great deal of admiration for Irving Weber. It was a great native Iowan who was one of the prominent historians of American history, Carl Becker. He was born in Black Hawk County and truly one of the great American historians. He said every man, and I suppose if he lived today, he would use the gendered language, every person, every woman, every man is their own historian. And Irving Weber felt that very deeply, and from 1973 on, he began writing a series of articles in Iowa City. Often they dealt with athletic themes, but a wide-ranging sensibility about the history of the area. Iowa gets a knock as a place that's not terribly diverse, and yet I think that's what makes it interesting, in the sense that as I got started researching this topic, what an important contribution African Americans made to the rise of Iowa sports to the big time. It's, in fact, unthinkable that Iowa would have the kind of athletic history it does without the contribution of African Americans. In general, the contribution of African Americans was such that there were only few in the early period, but it's important to note that, say, in like a region in the South, there were none. They were barred from participating. So at Iowa, it started slow, but as the racial climate of the nation changed by the 1950s, Iowa had garnered a reputation, not just by the university itself, but I think critically by African Americans as being a haven for the black athlete. And I guess now would be an appropriate time to show you a little a source that I discovered. Probably the most important and influential of African American athletes was a guy by the name of Fred Duke Slater. Today there is Slater Hall on the University of Iowa campus. I've walked by there a number of times and I've asked people whether they have any idea who this building is named after. And of course, too often the co-eds that walk out of there don't know. But Duke Slater was an early All-American, African American, and he was a native of Clinton, Iowa, came to the university, and was part of a legendary team that won a mythical national title, and 4 players off that 1921 team later entered the College Football Hall of Fame. And more than that, they, in a very memorable game, defeated Notre Dame here in Iowa City. Notre Dame had been a odds-on favorite for the national championship, had a winning streak, the longest in the nation at the time, and Duke Slater and company defeated them. Just to give you a sense that Duke Slater wasn't just an Iowa phenomenon, but a national phenomenon, I'd like to show you a brief clip.
You can't compare to those women. What I mean is...
Here we go. Now this clip was in its day a newsreel, and this one was entitled Negro Sports Heroes. And what you'll see, I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but it's sort of a discussion of in the day, and this is roughly late 1940s, early 1950s, of some of the great contributions that African Americans have made in all fields, industry, sport, and so on. But this particular one is on sports. We'll start with a little snippet of the Harlem Globetrotters, but I just kind of want you to watch and get a sense of what an African American community might be viewing and seeing on their newsreel.
Yes, that's some outfit, Jesse.
Every man's
Jesse
a
Owens.
champion, Mr. Barnett, and everyone's a credit to our people.
People respect a real champion. Let's see some champs in other sports.
Boxing has produced many champions. From the cradle of champions, the Golden Gloves, came the greatest of them all, Joe Louis. He held the heavyweight crown for 13 years. Now Joe's an official of the International Boxing Club, and here helps to sign two who succeeded him as champ, Jersey Joe Wolcott and Ezra Charles. King of the lightweights, Kid Gavilan. He came out of Cuba and cut down all opposition with a great ring technique and his famous bolo punch. Pound for pound, the greatest fighter of our day. That's what the boxing experts say about welterweight champ Sugar Ray Robinson. Gridiron greats, Duke Slater of the University of Iowa, one of the first Negro All-Americans. He's now...
Homer Harris, first black football captain in the Big Ten, was a University of Iowa football player. Dick Culberson, first black basketball player in the Big Ten Conference. Earl Banks, he played in the 1940s, was later elected to the College Football Hall of Fame as a coach. Calvin Jones, the first black to win the Outland Trophy, was an Iowa standout in the 1950s. Simon Roberts was the first black to win an NCAA wrestling title in the 1950s. Emlyn Tennell, who was a Hawkeye player in the 1940s, was the first black player to be elected to the NFL Hall of Fame. Eddie Robinson, of course, the winningest coach in college football, was a student at Iowa in the 1950s. He came to get a master's degree, I think in education or physical education, and he was here during the Evie period, and Evie had kind of, Evie's offense was given to Eddie Robinson, and he continued to use it the rest of his career, and they had a great relationship and a key to the film room, and he was going to come back and study a PhD, but apparently he learned all he needed to know and stayed at Grambling. Ted Wheeler, of course, a longtime Iowa Citian, was an Olympian and named the first black cross-country coach in Division I and later the first black head track coach in the Big Ten. In the 1950s, a Hawkeye football team integrated the Orange Bowl, the first integrated game in the Orange Bowl, in a game against Miami. Of course, in 1969, there was the black boycott of spring football, which included Dennis Green, later coach at Northwestern, Stanford, and the Minnesota Vikings in the NFL. And of course, he was the first black head coach in the Big Ten and the second black head coach in the NFL. In the 1980s, this is getting into the period that I remember, George Raveling and C. Vivian Stringer were hired in the same year to lead their respective programs in the Big Ten, again, breaking a barrier there. Of course, to keep this not totally on the celebratory track, there have been scandal all throughout. Scandal with Ozzie Simmons and his coach, the betting scandal of Connie Hawkins, some of you may remember. Ronnie Harmon and Devon Mitchell got involved in a agent and exchange of money scandal in the 1980s, ably reported by Tom Witowski of the Des Moines Register. And of course, currently, the image in many people's minds is that of Pierre Pierce and the legal troubles that he is in. So there is a integral connection to the history of African Americans and sports at Iowa.